So in the previous presentation, we looked at the idea of faith-based advocacy groups that we should insist that our politicians promote more development aid for poor countries, aid that is better directed towards meeting their actual needs, and the idea of debt cancellation. The final truly significant thing that faith-based advocates for the global poor talk about is promoting what they call fair trade policies rather than free trade policies. Let's think first about why trade policies matter so much. In an increasingly globalized economic system, global trade policies surely have a major impact on economic outcomes in every country in the world. Common sense also would say that it's better for us to develop fair policies of trade between countries so that poor countries can earn their living in international trade rather than depending so much on charity or on developmental assistance or on emergency relief. Wouldn't it be a whole lot better if they could become self-sufficient through being able to participate in international trade to their own advantage? And another thing I think it's important to point out is that economic trade is a primary way that you and I are related to people around the globe. The shirt on our back was probably made in a factory somewhere in China or in Indonesia or in Ecuador or Honduras. You and I are directly related, or indirectly related, I guess we should say, to that worker through the policies and institutions that have brought that clothing from that factory to us, to our closet, to our body. So there are two broad general approaches to thinking about trade policy. There is free trade, or what sometimes is called the neoliberal model, which has been the primary model under which the United States and Western European countries and Japan have structured their trade deals. As an alternative to that, there is what the faith-based advocates call fair trade. Free trade, as I said, has been the dominant model for international trade since World War II, and especially since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. Free trade is promoted by the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank, all of which are institutions created and supported primarily by the U.S., European nations, and Japan. Now, the key tenets of the free trade approach is that markets, which are freed from governmental intervention, will bring economic well-being to most people. Another key tenet is the idea of comparative advantage. This idea is that every country will come out best in international trade if it focuses on what it can produce and sell at a comparative advantage to other countries. For example, consider China. China's greatest resource is its huge population. Its comparative advantage lies in the area of cheap labor costs. And so it's to its advantage to produce products and sell products in the global market that take advantage of their cheap labor. Every other country should focus on that which gives it an advantage in the international market. And free trade creates incentives for each country to do that. This commitment to free trade, or the neoliberal model, involves several policy approaches. First, it promotes the elimination of tariffs. Tariffs are taxes, basically, that countries put on products imported from another country. Those taxes raise the prices and create an advantage for the producers of those same products within the country. Free traders say, let's eliminate tariffs so that everyone can compete fairly. Similarly, they advocate the elimination of subsidies that support prices for national industries and agricultural producers, so that that their prices to the consumer are driven down. Again, creating advantages for the domestic producer over against the foreign producer. So let's eliminate tariffs and subsidies so that producers, foreign and domestic, are competing freely or fairly with one another. Another thing advocated by free traders is reducing environmental, safety, and wage regulations, enabling poorer countries to fully utilize their possible comparative advantage with regard to certain goods and services without having them burdened by environmental regulations, regulations protecting the safety of their workers, which are common in the industrial countries, and certainly no minimum wage laws, so they can take advantage, as China has, for example, of the advantage they might have in terms of providing cheap labor. This entire approach emphasizes that free trade policies will enable countries to raise their gross national product, under the belief, as the saying goes, that a rising tide lifts all boats. If the nation's gross national product is higher because of its participation freely in international trade, those benefits will flow to everyone. Now, the critics call that trickle-down economics. Yes, make it possible for great wealth to be earned with the hope that it trickles down to those who most need wealth, those at the bottom, the poor. Now, we have seen that global poverty has been reduced significantly in recent decades. And I think it must be said that's largely as a result of free trade approaches to international trade. It has enabled the inclusion of many, many lower income nations into the global economy to the benefit of many poor people in those countries, particularly China, Brazil, and India. That, as we've suggested, may be a significant part of the reason that millions have risen out of abject poverty through low-end employment with transnational corporations. Now, it also must be said that this has contributed to the growing inequality between and within nations, and as profits have flowed primarily to those at the top. And all this may have made poor people around the globe even more vulnerable to the shifting winds of the international market, rather than enabling them to have a stable, steady, sustainable access to goods and services. I hope you've taken advantage of the opportunity to watch that Why Poverty video called Land Rush. I think it illustrates some of the effects and problems associated with free trade. That film focuses on a relatively poor community in the country of Mali where people survived on subsistence farming. And the film depicts the pressure on them to integrate themselves into the global economy through a proposal to build a huge sugar exporting plant on their farmland, which had previously been dedicated to subsistence farming. Those villagers faced a difficult choice. Should they hold on to their land, or try to hold on to their land and maintain their traditions of subsistence farming under which they have survived for centuries? Or should they sell or have their land taken for a global sugar manufacturing enterprise that would enable many of them to get jobs for higher wages as part of the operation? That the villagers disagreed among themselves about what to do shows the reality of the dilemma they faced. Now, the critics of free trade policies point out that, in fact, the wealthy nations have often been quite unfair in practice. That is to say, they continue to provide subsidies and tariff protection, particularly on agricultural products, that make it virtually impossible for poor countries' products to compete in the international market. So, for example, despite our advocacy of free trade, the United States provides high levels of tariff and subsidy protection for producers of cotton, soybeans, and other products, agricultural products, that poor countries might be able to produce and sell in the global market if it were truly a free trade scenario. Free trade has meant that farmlands dedicated to domestic food production in poorer countries have often become dedicated now to products for exportation, as was being envisioned in that film Land Rush, right? Moreover, it leaves workers vulnerable to abuse. Often free trade policies and the deals that poor countries have had to make with transnational corporations results in the outlawing of unions or their severe restriction, making it virtually impossible for the workers there to get higher wages or safe working conditions. Free trade policies have meant reduction in environmental protection and have contributed to the environmental degradation. And the critics say it has aggravated the inequality between those at the top and those at the bottom, and that this approach makes huge expansion of wealth or gross national product necessary for some of it to trickle down to those who need it most. And of course, these policies have been forced on unwilling nations often as an aspect of debt relief. Structural adjustment programs as a part of debt relief have often forced these free trade policies on poor countries. So what do the advocates of fair trade want? First, they want tariff and subsidy reduction in rich countries. That is to say, they want rich countries to stop hypocritically protecting their own industries, particularly their agricultural industries, actually in contradiction to their own apparent advocacy of free trade. And by reducing tariffs and subsidies, they would improve access to markets and consumers in the rich nations for products produced in poorer ones. So actually, what they're asking for at this level is a more consistent application of the free trade ideology to the rich countries themselves. Although I think they would like to see also the poor countries to be able themselves to use tariffs and subsidies to protect their own industries and their own agricultural producers so that they can begin to compete more favorably in the international market. The advocates of fair trade would like to see regulations that improve wages and working conditions and workers' rights in poor countries, eliminating what are often called sweatshops. They certainly advocate regulations to protect the environment in poor countries, advocating what they call sustainable development. Yes, we want development in poor countries, but we want to do it in a way that is sustainable in the sense of ways that do not degrade and undermine the environment, which would ultimately undermine the ability of those countries to produce wealth for the poor in those countries. Finally, they would like to emphasize targeted economic development and growth rather than simply increasing gross national product. So when you focus on increasing gross national product, you hope that the benefits trickle down to the poor. The advocates of fair trade said, let's focus development assistance and trade policy on those at the bottom who need help worse. Yes, we want economic growth, but the advocates of fair trade say we want economic growth with equity, with the attention to those at the bottom. Well, hopefully this gives you some sort of introductory understanding of global trade policy and the debate between those who advocate free trade as opposed to those who advocate fair trade. But be assured, most of the faith-based advocacy groups who are focusing on the effective ways of addressing global poverty tend to favor fair trade policies rather than free trade policies. So what can you and I, who are not poor, do to help those who are? We can live more simply. We can consume more responsibly. We can give more generously. And alongside all of that, we can connect with the poor. And we can take advantage of our status as citizens in a democratic society to demand that our politicians make poverty a priority by increasing developmental assistance, by making developmental assistance better address the needs of those in poor countries rather than serving the interests of groups within our own country. We can advocate for debt cancellation so that poor countries have more resources to commit to their own people's public education and roads and infrastructure and health care. And we can favor free trade, fair trade policies rather than free trade policies.